Rationally Speaking is a presentation of New York City skeptics dedicated to promoting critical thinking, skeptical inquiry, and science education. For more information, please visit us at nycskeptics.org.
Welcome to Rationally Speaking, the podcast where we explore the borderlands between reason and nonsense. I'm your host, Massimo Pigliucci, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Julia Gelef. Julia, what are we going to talk about today?
Massimo, our topic today is celebrities and the damage they can do.
Ooh.
We're going to talk about the phenomenon of celebrities using the spotlight to pontificate about things they don't have expertise in, and in many cases on which they don't have their facts straight. So
pontificating, that's one of my favorite activities.
I borrowed that word from you.
Thank you. It's usually the Pope that does it. You know, that's where the word comes from.
Oh, that's
the
right.
The Pope is the Pontifex Maximus. The
one
top,
who maximally pontificates.
Exactly. The maximum pontificator.
Which adds that extra frisson of irony when you talk about Jenny McCarthy pontificating. So some of the standard examples of the phenomenon we're referring to here come from entertainment. So yeah, Jenny McCarthy talking about vaccines causing autism, or Bill Maher slamming Western medicine. But we're also going to try to touch on people who actually are experts in one technical field, who give their opinion about topics outside of their area of expertise. So I'll start out. Massimo, you asked a bunch of questions in the teaser for this episode around this general topic. So to frame this discussion, I organized them a little bit. I think they fall into three categories. First, why do celebrities talk about things they don't have expertise in? Second, why are they given a platform to speak about these issues? And third, finally, why do people listen to them, and why are they influenced by them?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Probably we should start with a little bit of a couple of examples, because as you were saying earlier, there are different categories of this phenomenon. So we go, for instance, from somebody at one extreme. Let me put these two people in the same sentence: Jenny McCarthy and Stephen Hawking.
Stephen Hawking, eh?
Yes. So because
I think the first time they've been in the same sentence together?
Possibly. So I think that there are good bookhands to this continuum that we're going to be talking about today. Okay. Obviously, Jenny McCarthy is famous for her anti-vaccination campaign. So she's convinced, because she has an autistic child who became autistic after being vaccinated, she's convinced that modern medical science is wrong, and she's correct. There's a causal connection between vaccination and autism. Now, as probably most of our listeners know, there is in fact no evidence at all for this connection. The only paper that presented allegedly any evidence of this sort was published about a decade ago, was retracted by the journal. The paper was based on fraudulent data. There has been plenty of research that has been done since that in fact has found no link whatsoever. So as far as medical science is concerned, there is no link, or at least there is absolutely no evidence of link, even though people have looked at it very hard. Nonetheless, we have a situation where about 40% of Americans at this point are seriously considering not vaccinating their children, which of course could potentially be resulting into a healthcare catastrophe over the next several years. Now, Jenny McCarthy is a clear example of somebody who literally doesn't know what she's talking about. She has absolutely no technical background in medical research, in biology, or anything like that. She is speaking out of a single example. She's committing one of the most elementary logical fallacies, the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, after this, therefore, because of that. So there seems to be, to me, that is a clear case where any sensible person will simply look at her claims and say, okay, the woman is a cuckoo, and we just need to ignore her. Of course, as you pointed out, people don't ignore her. In fact, plenty of people are more than happy to follow her lead, whatever it may go. Now, at the opposite end of that spectrum is somebody who's like Stephen Hawking, who I think we mentioned in the past. His latest book, which of course is about cosmology, starts out, I think, just the second sentence or the second paragraph, with a complete out-of-hand dismissal of the entire field of philosophy on the ground that it hasn't made any contribution to science over the last several decades. Now, here is somebody who, again, does not actually have any technical expertise in the field, and Stephen Hawking is a physicist, he's not a philosopher, and who because of his position as a celebrity of sorts, I mean, not the same kind of celebrity that Jenny McCarthy is, but certainly a celebrity of sorts. You know, the guy sells a lot of books. He has also a reputation, well-deserved reputation as a scientist. Makes a comment that is demonstrably, at the very least, questionable. You can't say that comment is false in the same sense in which Jenny McCarthy's comment is false, right? Because it's a matter of opinion, first of all, whether philosophy or any other field is relevant or interesting. That's a matter of opinion. But by the fact that Hawkins said, I don't think philosophy has anything to contribute anymore because it has been useless to science, that comment makes very clear that he's making a category mistake.
In what sense?
In the sense that the point of philosophy is not to solve scientific questions. So that would be like saying we should do away with literary criticism or painting or music because it hasn't made any contribution to science. Well, if anybody were to make that kind of comment, it would be laughed out of court for reasons similar to the ones that I think Stephen Hawking should be left out of court in that case. Now, that said, however, it is at the opposite extreme because, as I said, this is a situation which, first of all, is much more esoteric. We're talking about the relationship between science and philosophy. It's debatable. It's not based on matters of fact. And yet, I think that those two examples are on the same continuum because we are, in both cases, talking about somebody who is clearly making offhand comments about things that he or she does not know pretty much anything about.
I don't want to get too bogged down in the Stephen Hawking example too early on.
Oh, why not?
But I read that example in the teaser that you wrote, and I saw the quote you were referring to in Stephen Hawking's latest book, and I can't get behind the idea that he's making a category error. I mean, of course, with respect to some branches of philosophy, to most branches of philosophy, it would not. Their point is not to solve scientific questions. But I thought it was clear from context that Hawking was talking about the kinds of philosophy that are trying to answer questions about the fundamental nature of the universe, which, I mean, okay, so I went to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy page on metaphysics, and pretty much verbatim, the questions discussed there are, does space extend infinitely in every direction? Is space a substance or a mere system of relations between things? Are the past and future as real in the same sense as that in which the present is real? Why does space have 3 dimensions and not 4 or 7? And
right.
These are all questions about the nature of the universe, and they're questions which are central to a lot of physicists' work.
Right.
So it doesn't seem like a category error to me for Stephen Hawking to say that philosophers are this kind of philosophy is trying to answer questions about the nature of the universe and hasn't really contributed much recently.
Right. But first of all, he was not talking about metaphysics specifically. He was talking about philosophy in general.
No, he just said philosophy. But then the worst you can accuse him of is not using a specific enough word.
No, that's like making the mistake of mistaking biology with science. It's a big mistake, and it's a mistake that an intellectual that the caliber of Hawking shouldn't be making, particularly when writing a book about for the general public that has in fact nothing to do with philosophy. That's my first objection. The second objection is actually. If you read recent literature in metaphysics, philosophers who do metaphysics do, in fact, take quite a bit from science.
They take from science, but
yes.
He was saying they don't give to science.
That is not true either, because there is a lot of metaphysics, for instance, of time travel that is the result of collaborations between mathematicians, physicists, theoretical physicists, and philosophers. Because the fact is, as you probably know, that there are interesting paradoxes that are logical paradoxes as far as time travel is concerned. And a logical paradox is not going to be solved by physics. It's going to be informed by our understanding of, say, time, which of course has to be the result of our understanding of physics. But whether time travel is physically possible or not, it presents separate categories of problems, such as logical problems, which I think are the perfect example of how science and philosophy work together. So no, I'm not going to be able to grant Stephen Hawking much of a leeway in that area.
Okay, that's fine. I just wanted to register an objection, but let's move on and talk about.
But your point is interesting, because as you just demonstrated, we can have a reasonable discussion about how far off the mark Hawkins was. In my opinion, obviously, he was way off the mark. In your opinion, perhaps a little less. But we can have, in fact, a reasonable discussion, a reasonable disagreement about that. I don't think the two of us could have a reasonable disagreement about how far off Jenny McCarthy is.
Right.
Or, for instance, to pick one of our producers' favorite example, Bill Maher. Now, Bill Maher is an interesting one because, so he's a comedian, of course, as a sort of a background, but he's become a social commentator, just like many other comedians have done in their career. And in fact, I think that's a perfectly fine role because if you think about it, being a comedian means that you apply your sense of humor to situations that often are, in fact, to do with politics or social issues and so on and so forth. So becoming a commentator, social commentator, in the sort of light sense of the term, I think is perfectly fine, right? Now, I happen to actually agree with a lot of Bill Maher's political opinions. Sometimes I disagree. But even if you agree or disagree with his political opinions, you can see that those are usually considered opinions. You can have a reasonable disagreement along the lines of the ones that the two of us just had about Hawking. What you cannot possibly have a reasonable disagreement is when Bill Maher goes off the deep end and rejects the entirety of Western medicine and thinks that he's not going to get vaccinated against anything because he doesn't want other people, he doesn't want, quote, the government to put extraneous substances in his blood circulation. That is idiotic. And what baffles me is that a person that is otherwise very intelligent, by any reasonable definition of intelligent, can in fact make that sort of completely against the fact sort of statement. That's what I think it's the most baffling part of these question.
Sure. Well, that's not particular to celebrities. That baffling question applies to humanity in general.
It does. In the case of celebrities, of course, it comes with more responsibility because they have more access to the public.
Sure. I do think we should probably separate out the question of whether a celebrity has background in, has knowledge about a subject, from whether we feel okay with them speaking about it in the public. Because there are definitely celebrities that are not experts in whatever cause they've taken up, but we're fine with it because they happen to get it right. Like the celebrities promoting, the fight against global warming. I think Leonardo DiCaprio has set up a foundation for that, and he's, hosted a couple documentaries about it and that sort of thing. And he's no expert in climate science any more than Bill Maher is an expert in medicine. But
that's correct.
That's fine.
And there are plenty of celebrities who are involved in social issues, for instance, or political issues even. George Clooney has done a lot of work in Sudan and Chad, in that area of Africa. And he's done good work. But in fact, in that particular case, I happen to have semi-direct knowledge of that kind of work because I know people that have worked with him. And he has done the intelligent thing. That is, he picked a cause because he wanted to do some good, and then he went to the experts. In particular, he went to an organization called the International Rescue Committee, which has a large presence. It's a humanitarian organization, disaster relief organization, that has a huge presence in Sudan, that has operated there for many years. And Clooney went to them to say, okay, here I have money and I have access. What should I do? That is the intelligent thing to do. So definitely this discussion should not be taken as a sort of across-the-board criticism of the idea of a celebrity, for one thing, and certainly not even of the idea that celebrities shouldn't talk about about whatever issue they feel like talking about. The question is, how should they do it? And when they do it wrongly, why do people pay attention?
Right. So let's back up a little bit and talk about why they're being given this platform in the first place. Because, sure, sometimes celebrities will just, tweet to their followers whatever their opinion is on something. So they're not being approached there. But oftentimes they're asked questions by journalists, or they're invited on a talk show and asked questions about subjects they don't know anything about. So, I mean, I know that people will often say they don't understand why celebrities are asked for their opinion on topics they have no background in. I would say the answer is largely simple, that they're asked for their opinion for the same reason that people ask their friends for their opinion on things. That, like, if you're interested in someone, if you like them, if you're familiar with them and you find them entertaining, you're often interested in their opinions, even if they're not an expert. So then I guess the question is really, why are their opinions influential, as opposed to why are people interested in hearing their opinions?
Right. No, that's a good point. I think you're absolutely right. The whole idea of having a celebrity interviewed on, especially in these formats that are becoming more and more popular, where the celebrity goes to a show and he or she sits down on a chair or a couch or something. So the whole environment looks like a chat among friends, right?
Right.
And so the idea is, of course, that the audience is brought into the same chat and we're all friends and we're all listening to each other. Yes, you're absolutely right. I think that is what's going on there. But of course, I assume that it's not a rational thing to do if we were having a chat among friends and somebody said to me, by the way, you shouldn't be vaccinating your daughter. And I asked him, well, do you have any background in medicine? And he says, absolutely not. But I know the science better than the doctors. I would say, well, sorry, but we're friends, but I'm gonna stay away from that kind of silly advice. So the question is, as you were saying, why is it that so many people why it's not why celebrities are asked their opinions, is why is it that so many people seem to take that opinion seriously,
right,
even though it's pretty obvious that the person in question does not actually have the technical know-how to provide a knowledgeable opinion. Everybody's entitled to an opinion, but there's a difference between being entitled to an opinion and then following somebody's opinion just because on what grounds. That's the question.
Right. Maybe now would be a good time to bring in a comment from one of our commenters named Graham, who actually questioned the notion that celebrities actually do influence people, or that the endorsement by a celebrity of an idea is convincing to people to believe that idea. So Graham says, I'm not sure how much celebrities really convince people to believe in anything. I think their main function in promoting ridiculous ideas is just increased exposure. For example, I doubt anyone thinks, even unconsciously, quote, Jenny McCarthy believes vaccines cause autism, so it's probably true. Celebrities just happen to be in a beneficial position of having media attention, so they can talk about whatever they want, and there's a certain segment of the population that's receptive to the ideas. They're just increasing the overall number of people that get exposed to the idea, end quote.
That's an interesting point, but yeah. I kind of disagree with that.
I think it's an important distinction to make, at least just to keep in mind, because it's true that even if people weren't actually influenced by a celebrity endorsement of an idea, you'd still see support for that idea go up after a celebrity endorsement, merely from the fact that people were introduced to the idea. So the question of interest is whether support for the idea goes up more because the celebrity endorsed it, as compared to, say, if the same number of viewers saw a non-celebrity endorse the idea. I don't know if that's possible to get at experimentally, but...
Yeah, that's a good question for social scientists, and I don't know what data, if any, are out there about this, but I have this perhaps pessimistic impression that if a celebrity endorses a reasonable notion, that notion isn't going to carry as much as with the public.
Oh, so you think it's not just unrelated, it's actually negatively related to reasonableness.
Right. So and here's
that
why.
Is pessimistic.
It is pessimistic, isn't it? But here's why. I think that something along the lines of what our commenter said is correct. That is, clearly somebody has a platform, whatever that person says is bound to have a broader audience than if your neighbor said it. But I also think that there is a particular tendency, both by celebrities themselves, of course not everyone, but by a good enough, large enough number, and especially on the part of the public, to present and therefore to buy in the case of the public, notions that are contrary to whatever the establishment is supposed to be. It's perceived to be, in this case, the scientific establishment. Right? So your doctor says that you should vaccinate it, and here comes this person, this famous person who says, "No, forget your doctor. He's in the pockets of the pharmaceutical industry. Therefore, you shouldn't believe it." And people seem to relish that sort of conspiracy-based rejection of authority, even though, of course, they don't seem to realize that they are in fact making an argument for authority of a different kind. They're just believing a non-technically grounded celebrity as opposed to their doctor. But it's still an argument from authority.
Right, and I think that's related to the question of why are celebrities given this platform when they are, because ideas that are, as you were saying, contrary to sort of the common wisdom, the established wisdom, are just more interesting. And so the media is much more likely to promote those and to splash those onto the headlines of their magazines and their talk shows.
That's right, which goes back to the idea that this is the classical situation where everybody is a culprit. The celebrities themselves, of course, should be much more careful about what they say and how. The public should be a little more grounded in critical thinking. There goes an optimistic statement, and but it's also the media, right? So the media should be ideally the media is supposed to be the filter between the nonsense and or the authorities on the one hand, and the public, and on the other hand, more and more larger segment of the media don't play that role. They play, in fact, in some sense, the opposite role, that they go out fishing for the most absurd notion, and they present it just because it is absurd, just because it is unusual, just because it is sensationalistic.
Sure. I want to go back to Graham's point that people aren't actually thinking, even unconsciously, that Jenny McCarthy believes this, so it must be true. I think there is actually some evidence against that idea. Or in other words, there's psychological research that suggests that sort of thing does happen, that people are influenced unconsciously, even if they would explicitly say that this person isn't an expert, and so I shouldn't believe them. So there's this well-known cognitive bias called the halo effect, in which the perception of one trait of a person or of a thing is influenced by your perception of a totally different trait of theirs. So the classic example is that we judge attractive people to be more intelligent, which this experimental result has been confirmed again and again.
I always thought you were very bright.
Thanks, Massimo. All along, just the halo. Thanks. Appreciate that. Anyway.
Sorry.
Is that necessary? Okay.
No, but it was funny.
So anyway, there's a bunch of experiments that researchers have done where they show people photos of strangers, and the subjects judge the more attractive people as being more skilled, more intelligent, more friendly, and a bunch of other positive traits. So it shouldn't be surprising that celebrities who are far more attractive and glamorous than your typical person get a big kickback from the halo effect when they're talking about something even completely unrelated to their career.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That does remind me of another effect that I often mention to my students in sort of critical thinking classes, which is, I refer to it as the Nobel syndrome. Uh-huh. And the Nobel syndrome is, I've noticed many times over many years that as soon as somebody wins the Nobel Prize, that person suddenly becomes an expert on almost anything. Right. And, obviously, if somebody wins the Nobel Prize, by all reasonable standards, that person is both accomplished and very, very intelligent. So I don't think there is an issue here, again, of Jenny McCarthy kind of type of situation. But nonetheless, if you win the Nobel Prize in, say, particle physics, it seems to me silly out of anybody to ask you your opinion about, I don't know, world peace or politics or economics or anything, in fact, outside of quantum mechanics or whatever it is that you wanted the Nobel Prize in. That happens actually a lot of the times. And in fact, a lot of Nobel winners go around giving sort of general lectures about things that are really not necessarily much to do with the specific research or topic for which they were awarded the Nobel. I mean, the Nobel, most of the times, especially in the sciences, certainly in the sciences, is a very specific kind of reward. It's for a very specific piece of work that usually has very little sort of general implications outside of the narrow field in which the Nobel is awarded. That's different, of course, in the case of Nobels for non-scientific fields to some extent. Although even there's a problem. But particularly in the case of science-based Nobel, it's very bizarre. You listen to these people who are obviously intelligent, obviously articulate, talking about things of which they probably know nothing about.
It just occurred to me that people's tendency, the Nobel effect that you're describing, is probably related to people's sense that there is this underlying quantity that's just intelligence. It's not that there are different kinds of intelligence. It's just that there's a name for it that social science researchers use.
General intelligence. Yes.
General intelligence. Mm-hmm. And that other kinds of intelligence are just manifestations of this. Right.
I think that's a good point. Actually, that is a good point. First of all, as you know, there is mounting evidence now in the social sciences and in cognitive sciences that in fact there are several different types of intelligences. Of course, there is disagreement about how to measure them. There's disagreement about how many types that there actually are and how distinct they are. I'm not so sure that I would call some of these types of intelligences. For instance, there's talk of emotional intelligence.
Okay, so the language gets a little figurative.
Yes, exactly.
But I'm not even sure what it would mean to have an underlying single intelligence. Like, I don't even know how you could test for that. You can test people on different tasks, but I guess you could test to see if they're all correlated.
Right, and that is exactly how the idea came about to begin with. When people started administering intelligent IQ tests, intelligent quotient tests, right? That's a fascinating history, which, by the way, it's recounted very well in the classic book by Stephen Jay Gould, The Mismeasure of Men. Mm-hmm. And the origin of that test is interesting. It was introduced by Alfred Binet, a French researcher whose objective was actually to identify young children who were lagging behind at school so that they could be helped.
Right.
And of course, immediately,
it was actually socially progressive.
Right, it was socially progressive.
Attempts,
as soon as it crossed the Atlantic and came to the United States, it was used exactly the other way around to discriminate against people who were behind for whatever reason. Now, from there, the jump was very quick to assume that somehow IQ had a genetic basis, even though the evidence about that is very controversial, to say the least. And then from there on, of course, people started to figure out whether there was a variety of tests by which you can measure allegedly IQ. And so there were different schools about you should measure this way or that way and so on. So people came up with this idea that perhaps these tests are correlated, and the correlation is represented by these underlying factor, the G factor you were talking about earlier. Now, the way they went about it is they used something called factor analysis, which is a multivariate statistical technique, which was invented for the purpose. It was invented precisely for these question of when you have a bunch of different variables that may or may not measure an underlying similar variable. Can you establish that they do or they don't? Now, the interesting thing was, of course, that if you measure people on a variety of IQ scales, and then you do a factor analysis, it turns out that you can, in fact, extract statistically a common factor. But the problem
that's just an artifact of the statistical method, though. I don't think that we can take that as representing some real feature of your brain.
I agree, but it's actually, I think, an artifact of the tests, not of the statistics. It's an artifact of the tests in the sense that IQ tests tend to be very similar. They tend to measure, whatever they measure, they tend to be constructed in a very similar way. So it is no surprise that if you administer a bunch of tests that have essentially rather minor variations among themselves, people tend to score high. If people score high, they tend to score high on all of them. And if they score low, they score low on all of them. That does not mean that what you're measuring is an underlying native intelligence.
Right. Let's bring this discussion back to the question of celebrities being asked for their opinions on things. There's one other psychological phenomenon that I thought was relevant to the issue. So it's related to the halo effect, but it's specifically about the social prestige of the person who's giving an opinion. So actually, even before looking at the psychological research, you could already have guessed that prestige is convincing above and beyond attractiveness, even though celebrities tend to be attractive. If you look at the popular marketing technique of paying celebrities to endorse products, that seems to work, at least based on the fact that companies keep doing it. And in those cases, the audience actually knows explicitly that the celebrity is just being paid to endorse the product. And they're still influenced to buy products from that company. So you could imagine that when the celebrity seems to genuinely believe in the viewpoint that he or she is promoting, that the influence would be even stronger. And there was a cool study in PLOS ONE recently called Prestige Affects Cultural Learning in Chimpanzees, suggesting that this phenomenon is not unique to our particular section of the primate map. And so the researchers took a high-ranking chimpanzee and a low-ranking chimpanzee from the same troop of chimps. Chimps have a very rigid, highly structured social structure, as I'm sure you know. So the researchers trained each of the two chimps to do a trick, to collect plastic tokens that are lying around and to put them in a box in exchange for a treat. The trick was the same, but the high-ranking chimp's box was polka-dotted, and the low-ranking chimp's box was striped. So then the researchers returned the chimps to the troop, and they set up these boxes, and they observed what happened. So the other chimps quickly learned to copy the trick, but they overwhelmingly preferred to put their tokens in the polka-dotted box, which is the one that the high-ranking chimp was putting tokens in, even though the reward that they got was the same no matter which box they put the tokens in. The polka-dotted box ended up with 70% of the tokens, and then the researchers repeated this experiment in another troop, and the figure was even higher. It was the high-ranking chimp's box got 90% of the tokens. So the takeaway here is that we copy each other, but we're much more likely to copy prestigious members of our troops than lowly ones, which does make sense evolutionarily, right? Because the prestigious primates in the troop are more likely to be the ones who are bigger or stronger or more powerful, or they're the ones doing something right, like they're the ones with the good tracking skills or fighting skills or something. So it would make sense to copy them. And with modern day celebrities, if they're the highest prestige people in our society, then I think it's quite plausible that maybe we just aren't making a distinction based on what their prestige is for and whether it's relevant to the specific issue at hand.
No, you're right. It does make sense. Now, we also need to remember that there is a cultural component there, because as you just mentioned, in our society, and when you were giving the example of the chimps, which I think it is very appropriate in this discussion. For some reason, I was reminded of an observation that I made when I was very young, and I was just beginning to look into advertisements by American companies. So at the time, I was living in Italy, and I was into astronomy, amateur astronomy. And so I was shopping for a telescope. And it turns out that I was comparing advertisements for telescopes that were published in an Italian magazine about astronomy, and then in Sky and Telescope, which is, of course, the premier magazine of astronomy for amateur astronomers in the United States. And I still remember, this was 30 plus years ago. I still remember very clearly with my friends, we were making these obvious observation, obvious comment that if you looked at the Italian magazine, despite the reputation of Italians when it comes to advertisements and flashing pictures on the covers of magazines.
I don't know what you're talking about.
I'm sure you don't. The Italian magazine had a telescope, right? Just a telescope. Of course, it was in a very good light and color and all that sort of stuff, but there was technical specifications, and it was just a telescope.
Did the American magazine have girls in short shorts?
They absolutely did.
No,
they absolutely
you're kidding. I was kidding.
No, absolutely.
Oh my God.
They did. They had these beautiful young women just, lasciviously draped over the telescope.
I was kidding.
And I thought, what is going on here? Why would I buy a telescope because there's a young, attractive woman? And now, of course, having lived in the United States for more than 20 years, I know that that's the way it works.
What?
But it was a very strange observation. So we need also to take into account these issues of the cultural differences that even celebrity culture might work differently in different countries. And in this particular case that I just brought up, the example is of a comparison between two Western countries. But I'm sure the differences are even more so if we were to compare societies that are more wildly divergent from a cultural perspective. But the chimpanzee example is very interesting as well, because that tells you how deep the root actually of these kind of psychological behaviors is.
Right. And I think another important thing to keep in mind about these effects, the halo effect and this, I don't know, prestige effect, I don't know. That's what I've been calling it. I don't know if that's the official name. But the important thing to keep in mind about them is that they work implicitly rather than explicitly. So people may not even be aware that they're being influenced by those factors.
Right.
So I saw a poll recently from CBS that kind of made me roll my eyes. They asked people, whose voices do you trust on global warming? And the results were that people claimed to trust scientists a lot more than politicians and celebrities. And the article that was citing this poll concluded, quote, social research therefore suggests that star power may not help much when you want to persuade people to change their minds or behavior, end quote. That's not true.
That is not
true.
People
will say that celebrities don't influence them.
Right.
They may very well believe that celebrities don't influence them, but that does not mean that celebrities don't influence them.
That's right.
This is my problem with a lot of polling and focus group research across the board, that what people say about their behavior and motivations is just not a very accurate guide to what
and
those
a
are.
Smart social scientist knows how to tell the difference. I mean, you can actually test, you can do experiments to test whether there is in fact a congruence between what people say they're going to do and what actually people do. But now the thing about science is interesting because research does show that if you ask a question in the abstract to the American people, science as an abstract idea does have actually quite a lot of cachet in American culture. It does
cachet in the sense that people trust it or they
people
respect
trust
it.
That's right, respect it. It's a respected institution. It's a respected type of activity. But then you ask them, do you accept human-made climate change or do you accept evolution? And they all of a sudden say, well, I respect science, but not that part. And in fact, they will even tell you, oh, but that's not good science, as if they actually knew.
This is the no true Scotsman fallacy.
That's exactly right.
The no true scientist fallacy. No true scientist would make a claim like that.
And this goes back decades and decades. I was, just before coming here to tape this episode, I was reading a book on the ideological uses of biology over the last, it's called From Descartes to Dawkins. It's an interesting collection of essays. And the essay that I was reading coming here is by Ronald Numbers, who is an historian, I believe at the University of Wisconsin in medicine. who has written a lot about creationism. And so his chapter is about the history of creationism. And it's amazing how, as early as the 1910s and 20s, creationists were saying that they absolutely respect science. It's evolution that it's not good, because clearly that's bad science.
Right.
And it was so. The strategy goes back to at least a century in that specific application. So
the more things change,
the more
they stay the same. I think also sometimes the reason why celebrities are given a platform to talk about a field they're not experts in is that sometimes it's not actually obvious to a layperson, and say to the editor of a magazine or a TV show, which fields are actually relevant to which other fields. So, for example, if you had an empirical economist comment on research in psychology, that could be perfectly legitimate because the research methods are similar enough that the economist would be qualified to judge whether the psychologist had used good methodology and good statistical analysis and so on. But a case in which there's not as much overlap as many people would think is between climate scientists and meteorologists.
Right.
So, as you know, meteorologists are constantly being asked to give their opinion on global warming, and actually a lot of them have said they think it's a scam. But the science of meteorology is totally different from climate science. It deals with the short-term changes in weather. So they're looking at air pressure and water vapor and temperature interactions over the course of days, whereas the models that climate scientists use involve these very different specialized techniques and modeling software, and they're predicting these macro-scale global changes in climate over the long term. But I think it's an understandable mistake for lay people to make. They think, a meteorologist, they study weather and the atmosphere, they're qualified to weigh in on the subject. And that's why you get these unfortunate articles talking about all the weather experts that don't believe global warming is happening, and it threatens to discredit the field unjustifiably.
Now, the question, of course, and I think a couple at least of our commenters did raise this, is, well, what are we going to do about it? And
I didn't bring that up because I don't have any good answers. Maybe you do?
Well, I'm not sure that I have good answers. But for instance, there's something that I found out a couple of years ago when I was doing research for Nonsense and Stills, the book that came out last year. There's a chapter in there about celebrities. And so I did a little bit of research about, not just in the United States, but generally across the Western culture, let's say, how this phenomenon is dealt with. And I found out that there is an interesting group in the United Kingdom who has come up with this, at least novel idea. I'm not sure how effective it has been, but it is a novel idea. What they did was they set up a hotline for celebrities only. So if you are a celebrity and you're asked to go on television or radio or whatever, and you want to talk about something because it's dear to you, so let's take a positive case, one of those that you were mentioning earlier. Right, so a celebrity that wants to do some good on behalf of, say, climate change, right? But they don't know anything about climate change. Well, then these groups set up this hotline. The celebrity can call the number, and at the other side there is a member of this essentially skeptic organization who will in fact put him in touch with one or more experts in that particular area, and the experts will give them the celebrities the talking points, and they will answer the celebrity's question, so that the celebrity is in fact a little better equipped about talking about what he or she wants to talk about. Now, I doubt, unfortunately, that somebody like Jenny McCarthy would actually, of her own accord, call a skeptic hotline before going on television and talking about autism. But that is an interesting point, because at the very least, it makes it puts the burden in some sense on the other side, because if the group in question started, of course, sending out press releases to the press, and so in some sense you also put the media, the press, on alert and saying, look, guys, a lot of these people are actually saying nonsense, are talking nonsense, and there are ways to check about this. And presumably a more effective way to do this is to do something like the Center for Inquiry has been doing for years now, a media watch set up, so that the media have themselves one or more reference points to go and check if they're actually doing a story. Now, of course, that assumes we're talking about serious media like National Public Radio or the New York Times, and not Oprah's TV show. But nonetheless, I do agree with a point you were raising earlier, that often the media themselves don't know where to turn when it comes to expert opinion. So that's certainly one thing that can be done. Now, one of our commenters, I believe, raised the point that, well, you can teach critical thinking all you want, but if people want to believe what they want to believe, they will do it for emotional reasons. Certainly, that is the case in a lot of denialism and a lot of the denial of evolution. It's clearly rooted in religious emotion. The denial of the connection between vaccines and autism is rooted in personal experiences with their children, as well as their general distrust with big pharma and that sort of stuff. So critical thinking teaching by itself certainly isn't going to solve the problem, although I maintain that it would certainly be an improvement on what we have now. A perhaps more immediately efficacious way to do it is something that I've seen brought up recently precisely within the discussion about global warming, which is, why don't we play by the same rules? Why don't we, on the skeptic side, also use celebrities, go out and seek celebrities to make them our, the carriers of our message. Instead of having the skeptic or the scientist who usually are inept at talking to the press, they're usually not particularly good looking, they're usually not particularly tall, whatever that causes the halo effect. Why don't we pick, on the other hand, approach celebrities and make them ask them to do an emotional appeal? Now, the problem with that, of course, is a lot of scientists and skeptics shy away from that technique because they think that is manipulating the public. It's, you're not convincing people for the right reasons, you're convincing them through psychological means. Well, my friends, let's wake up, because that's the way it works in the short term. I think that there can be a two-pronged strategy, right? You can have a short-term effect by emotional appeal, as long as it's justified by the fact that it's based on solid understanding of the science, and then that gains you time, so that you can actually get people involved in long-term educational programs.
I like it. It's a little bit like one of my old favorite plays, Cyrano de Bergerac, in which the brilliant writer and thinker, who isn't all that pretty to look at, writes the scripts, which are then read to the lovely lady by the handsome but ditzy man. Let's
call it the Cyrano Project. And
yes! I'm totally behind that.
Let's ask our listeners and skeptics organizations to consider this seriously, because I think it might work, actually, to some extent.
All right. Let's wrap up this part of the Rationally Speaking podcast and move on to the Rationally Speaking picks.
Welcome back. Every episode, Julie and I pick a couple of our favorite books, movies, websites, or whatever tickles our rational fancy. Let's start, as usual, with Julia's pick.
Thanks, Massimo. Mine is actually a negative pick this week. I just read half of Jonah Lair's book.
You couldn't stand the whole thing?
I try to give a book a fair chance, but I put it down after about halfway through. The book is called Proust Was a Neuroscientist. And the idea of the book is that a bunch of modernist artists and writers actually discovered important facts about how our brains work well before scientists discovered those facts. So, for example, Lair points to Virginia Woolf's style of writing, in which it's very fragmented. She writes the internal monologues of characters as being sort of these multiple, loosely connected streams of consciousness, and he says that she, quote, knew that the self was too profound to be found.
That sounds very profound.
The whole book is written like that, Massimo. Another example, he points to the personal philosophy of the novelist George Eliot, who wrote that she believed in free will and she believed that people's personalities aren't predetermined by their genetics. And Lair says that, quote, the sprawling realism of Eliot's novels ended up discovering our reality. We are imprisoned by no genetic or social physics.
Really?
So basically,
I would say that we're imprisoned by both, actually.
Basically, as far as I can tell, what he did is he started with the developments in psychology and neuroscience over recent decades, and then he just went through modernist art and literature, and he searched for artists whose vision sort of loosely echoed something that turned out to be true about the brain. But that doesn't mean the artists discovered those facts. First, the parallels he's drawing are really fuzzy and hand-wavy. And second, they may have believed certain things, but it's not like they had any solid evidence for them. Lots of people believe lots of things, but we don't typically say that they know those things unless they have some good evidence for believing them. And what this reminded me of was, do you know that book, The Tao of Physics?
Yes.
Yeah. So this was this really popular book. it was in the 70s.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, it was a little while ago. And it was by a physicist, I believe, Capra. And he argued that Eastern mysticism had actually discovered the truths of quantum physics long before scientists got to them. And he trots out all these examples of mystical texts talking about connections between human consciousness and reality, which of course is identical to the way the probability wave function collapses when it's observed by a conscious being. Anyway, the point is, if you're willing to take enough artistic license in your interpretation, you can prove that any artist or mystic discovered some branch of science.
Right. In fact, when you were mentioning the book earlier, I was thinking precisely the Tao of Physics.
Really?
Yes.
You should read a little bit of
the new one.
Jonah Lehrer's book just to get a sample of it. Not to mention which, the book is really obnoxious in its tone towards science. The whole thing is dripping with this attitude of those arrogant, soulless scientists. They think they can explain everything, but they can't. So, for example, Lehrer says, scientists say we're nothing but a loom of electric cells in synaptic spaces. What science forgets is that this isn't how we experience the world. This is why we need art. Science doesn't forget that we have subjective experiences. It's just not their job to portray those experiences the way art does.
It's what we were calling earlier a category mistake.
Yes, actually, that's what I thought of when I was reading it. And he keeps talking about science as if it's opposed to art, the same way Romantic poets like Keats and Shelley did. So even the language he uses, for example, neuroscientists have ransacked the brain, but they have not yet found its source. Ransacked, like they're destroying the mystery by searching for it. This sort of thing really pisses me off.
I can see why you got upset.
Anyway, I'll try to calm down.
No, that's okay.
While you give your pick.
My pick is mostly positive. I think it's a good book that people who are interested in certain things, as I'll mention in a moment, you should read. Although it's not an unqualified sort of endorsement. The book is Science Fiction and Philosophy, From Time Travel to Superintelligence, edited by Susan Schneider. Now, it is one of these books that has become pretty popular over the last several years that use pop culture phenomena, science fiction, movies, TV series, and so on and so forth, to introduce the general public to philosophical issues. And I think that most of these books are actually fairly successful, some more than others. I contributed to a couple of them. I wrote a chapter for a book on the philosophy of The Daily Show, which was based on the Socratic method. And then I contributed a chapter that still has to come out, actually will come out sometime later this year, hopefully, to a book called The Philosophy of Sherlock Holmes, which is all about logical thinking and
very cool.
fallacy.
I'm looking forward to that one.
Yeah, so that should be fun. Now, this one is about science fiction. The reason I got interested in this is because I'm designing a new course at Lehman College on philosophy and science fiction, and so I think that this is a good way to start doing that sort of thing. So the way the book works is that it is divided in sections, each section with several chapters. Of course, and the sections deal with major topics. So the first section, for instance, is about could I be in a matrix or a computer simulation? And so it's about virtual worlds. Mm-hmm. The second one is, do I have free will and what is the nature of persons? The third part is about mind, both natural and artificial and possibly hybrid minds. The fourth section is on ethical and political issues, and the fifth one is on space and time, particularly space, time travel. Most of the essays are very good. Some of them are more controversial than others. Some of them, of course, I had my own opinions about why the author might be wrong. But all of them are thought-provoking. They all refer to a set at the beginning of each section. The book lists a number of movies that are loosely connected to the topics treated by the chapters. So one can watch one or more of the movies and then have a discussion informed by the chapter. So it's a very fun, informative book. I recommend it. Although again, with a grain of salt, because of course the individual essays are sort of varying quality. But otherwise, the topic is very interesting and it's very well done. So again, the book is Science Fiction and Philosophy, From Time Travel to Superintelligence.
Very cool. I hope that that at least one of the essays covers the question of whether Arnold Schwarzenegger was actually in the dream world in Total Recall the whole time or not, because that's what I really want to know.
Total Recall is listed as one of the movies.
Yes. Right? All right, we're all out of time, so this concludes another episode of Rationally Speaking. Join us next time for more explorations on the borderlands between reason and nonsense.
The Rationally Speaking podcast is presented by New York City Skeptics. For program notes, links, and to get involved in an online conversation about this and other episodes, please visit rationallyspeakingpodcast.org. This podcast is produced by Benny Pollack and recorded in the heart of Greenwich Village, New York. Our theme, Truth, by Todd Rundgren, is used by permission. Thank you for listening.
Or a mere system of relations between things? Are the past and future as real in the same sense as that in which the present is real? Why does space have 3 dimensions and not 4 or 7? And
right.
These are all questions about the nature of the universe, and they're questions which are central to a lot of physicists' work.
Right.
So it doesn't seem like a category error to me for Stephen Hawking to say that philosophers are this kind of philosophy is trying to answer questions about the nature of the universe and hasn't really contributed much recently.
Right. But first of all, he was not talking about metaphysics specifically. He was talking about philosophy in general.
No, he just said philosophy. But then the worst you can accuse him of is not using a specific enough word.
No, that's like making the mistake of mistaking biology with science. It's a big mistake, and it's a mistake that an intellectual that the caliber of Hawking shouldn't be making, particularly when writing a book about for the general public that has in fact nothing to do with philosophy. That's my first objection. The second objection is actually. If you read recent literature in metaphysics, philosophers who do metaphysics do, in fact, take quite a bit from science.
They take from science, but
yes.
He was saying they don't give to science.
That is not true either, because there is a lot of metaphysics, for instance, of time travel that is the result of collaborations between mathematicians, physicists, theoretical physicists, and philosophers. Because the fact is, as you probably know, that there are interesting paradoxes that are logical paradoxes as far as time travel is concerned. And a logical paradox is not going to be solved by physics. It's going to be informed by our understanding of, say, time, which of course has to be the result of our understanding of physics. But whether time travel is physically possible or not, it presents separate categories of problems, such as logical problems, which I think are the perfect example of how science and philosophy work together. So no, I'm not going to be able to grant Stephen Hawking much of a leeway in that.
Organize them a little bit. I think they fall into 3 categories. First, why do celebrities talk about things they don't have expertise in? Second, why are they given a platform to speak about these issues? And third, finally, why do people listen to them and why are they influenced by them?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Probably we should start with a little bit of a couple of examples, because as you were saying earlier, there are different categories of this phenomenon. So we go, for instance, from somebody at one extreme. Let me put these 2 people in the same sentence: Jenny McCartney and Stephen Hawking.
Stephen Hawking, eh?
Yes. So because
I think the first time they've been in the same sentence together? Possibly.
So I think that there are good bookends to this continuum that we're going to be talking about today.
Okay.
Obviously, Jenny McCartney is famous for her anti-vaccination campaign. So she's convinced, because she has an autistic child who became autistic after being vaccinated, she's convinced that modern medical science is wrong, and she's correct. There is a connection. There is a causal connection between vaccination and autism. Now, as probably most of our listeners know, there is in fact no evidence at all for this connection. The only paper that presented allegedly any evidence of this sort was published about a decade ago, was retracted by the journal. The paper was based on fraudulent data. There has been plenty of research that has been done since that in fact has found no link whatsoever. So as far as medical science is concerned, there is no link, or at least there is absolutely no evidence of link, even though people have looked at it very hard. Nonetheless, we have a situation where about 40% of Americans at this point are seriously considering not vaccinating their children, which of course could potentially be resulting into a
Rationally Speaking is a presentation of New York City skeptics dedicated to promoting critical thinking, skeptical inquiry, and science education. For more information, please visit us at nycskeptics.org.
Welcome to Rationally Speaking, the podcast where we explore the borderlands between reason and nonsense. I'm your host, Massimo Pigliucci, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Julia Gelef. Julia, what are we going to talk about today?
Massimo, our topic today is celebrities and the damage they can do.
Ooh.
We're going to talk about the phenomenon of celebrities using the spotlight to pontificate about things they don't have expertise in, and in many cases on which they don't have their facts straight. So
pontificating, that's one of my favorite activities.
I borrowed that word from you.
Thank you. It's usually the Pope that does it. That's where the word comes from.
Oh, that's
the
right.
The Pope is the Pontifex Maximus, the
one
top,
who maximally pontificates.
Exactly. The maximum pontificator.
Which adds that extra frisson of irony when you talk about Jenny McCarthy pontificating. So some of the standard examples of the phenomenon we're referring to here come from entertainment. So yeah, Jenny McCarthy talking about vaccines causing autism, or Bill Maher slamming Western medicine. But we're also going to try to touch on people who actually are experts in one technical field, who give their opinion about topics outside of their area of expertise. So I'll start out. Massimo, you asked a bunch of questions in the teaser for this episode around this general topic. So to frame this discussion,
But by the fact that Hawkins said, I don't think philosophy has anything to contribute anymore because it has been useless to science, that comment makes very clear that he's making a category mistake.
In what sense?
In the sense that the point of philosophy is not to solve scientific questions. So that would be like saying we should do away with literary criticism or painting or music because it hasn't made any contribution to science. Well, if anybody were to make that kind of comment, it would be laughed out of court for reasons similar to the ones that I think Stephen Hawking should be laughed out of court in that case. Now, that said, however, it is at the opposite extreme because, as I said, this is a situation which, first of all, is much more esoteric. We're talking about the relationship between science and philosophy. It's debatable. It's not based on matters of fact. And yet, I think that those two examples are on the same continuum because we are, in both cases, talking about somebody who is clearly making offhand comments about things that he or she does not know pretty much anything about.
I don't want to get too bogged down in the Stephen Hawking example too early on. But I read that example in the teaser that you wrote, and I saw the quote you were referring to in Stephen Hawking's latest book. And I can't get behind the idea that he's making a category error. I mean, of course, with respect to some branches of philosophy, to most branches of philosophy, it would not. Their point is not to solve scientific questions. But I thought it was clear from context that Hawking was talking about the kinds of philosophy that are trying to answer questions about the fundamental nature of the universe. Which, so I went to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy page on metaphysics, and pretty much verbatim, the questions discussed there are: does space extend infinitely in every direction? Is space a substance?
Healthcare catastrophe over the next several years. Now, Jenny McCarthy is a clear example of somebody who literally doesn't know what she's talking about. She has absolutely no technical background in medical research, in biology, or anything like that. She is speaking out of a single example. She's committing one of the most elementary logical fallacies, the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy, after this, therefore, because of that. So there seems to be, to me, that is a clear case where any sensible person will simply look at her claims and say, okay, the woman is a cuckoo, and we just need to ignore her. Of course, as you pointed out, people don't ignore her. In fact, plenty of people are more than happy to follow her lead, whatever it may go. Now, at the opposite end of that spectrum is somebody who's like Stephen Hawking, who I think we mentioned in the past. His latest book, which of course is about cosmology, starts out, I think just the second sentence or the second paragraph, with a complete out-of-hand dismissal of the entire field of philosophy on the ground that it hasn't made any contribution to science over the last several decades. Now, here is somebody who, again, does not actually have any technical expertise in the field, and Stephen Hawking is a physicist, he's not a philosopher, and who because of his position as a celebrity of sorts, I mean, not the same kind of celebrity that Jenny McCarthy is, but certainly a celebrity of sorts. You know, the guy sells a lot of books. He has also a reputation, well-deserved reputation as a scientist. Makes a comment that is demonstrably, at the very least, questionable. You can't say that comment is false in the same sense in which Jenny McCarthy's comment is false, right? Because it's a matter of opinion, first of all, whether philosophy or any other field is relevant or interesting. That's a matter of opinion.